In this video, we're going to explain exactly what HDR is and clear up some of the misconceptions around HDR, with particular focus on what it all means for working cinematographers. While much of the work building post-production workflows for HDR has already been done, many people working on set are still not fully aware of the many advantages and the implications that HDR brings to the industry. We'll be discussing HDR mainly in terms of the new Rec 2100 standard and Dolby Vision, but there are also other systems like HDR10, HDR10+, and Hybrid Log Gamma. HDR is certainly a more complex story than what we'll be able to outline here, so we'll add some links below if you want to take a deeper dive. This version of the video has been finished in standard Rec 709 SDR, but there is an HDR version available linked below if your system's capable. So what is HDR? In its simplest terms, HDR is the possibility of more contrast, more colours, and a minimum of 10-bit encoding, as well as the inclusion of metadata to help control the viewer's display. HDR is not just about brighter TVs. Underlying HDR is a new set of standards like ST2084 and Rec 2100 that create a new imaging framework for the 21st century. These standards leverage the capabilities of modern displays, but just as importantly, allow the authors of the image to control the picture on the final display. HDR is both mandated and supported by major industry players such as Netflix, Apple TV+, HBO Max, Disney+, Amazon Prime, and so on. Dolby Vision alone has already been used in over 8,000 TV and feature film productions, and there are already over 1 billion Dolby Vision-enabled consumer devices in the market. While most big productions are already finishing with an HDR master, in the coming years, inevitably smaller budget productions will also have to embrace HDR. You could ask, why bother with HDR? But that would ignore the fact that modern televisions are on an ever-improving trajectory. Most devices are already reaching 400 to 600 nits, with many capable of 1000 nits plus, while the industry continues using the 50-year-old 100 nit standard to judge and master its images. The 100 nit brightness standard incorporated into the Rec 709 specification was set for the now completely redundant cathode ray tube displays, and it's woefully out of date, with only approximately 6.5 stops of dynamic range. Without the industry changing its mastering and presentation standards, the images we produce to the 100 nit standard are simply stretched out and made brighter on modern TVs. This means that the look of the final pictures is being dictated by the television manufacturers, not the creatives. But what does this mean for cinematographers who are still monitoring and judging their work both on set and in the colour grade using last century's Rec 709 standard? The ACS Technology Committee set up a test shoot with the generous support of Luminati Studios here in Sydney, Panavision, Sony, and Cutting Edge Post. We invited Toby Oliver, ACS, to light and shoot some example scenes and to monitor on set in both HDR and SDR. Toby Oliver has a substantial body of international work behind him, both in TV network drama, streaming drama, and feature films, including the Oscar-winning Get Out in 2017. In the last few years, many of Toby's works have been finished in HDR, but he's never been able to monitor on set in HDR before. The ACS was also involved with a short film, Handled, photographed by ACS Technology Committee member Tom Gleeson, that initially was to be monitored on set in HDR, but due to COVID lockdowns ended up being monitored in SDR, but finished in HDR. The purpose of both of these setups was to start the conversation and to explore HDR workflow and how HDR might change or even influence the creative process.
When HDR was first brought up as part of the conversation, my first reaction was, this is TV marketing crap. Why are we interested in HDR? I mean, why do we want everything super bright? And that really was a complete misunderstanding on my part. What I didn't understand was that really is not a marketing term. It is a new image standard for the 21st century.
One of the main things to remember with shooting HDR is that on the camera end, the cameras or the cinema cameras that we're used to using, especially the high-end and mostly the high-end cameras, are already HDR. Now we're able to see that full dynamic range on our display monitor. The full capabilities of your camera are now becoming visible. And in a way, that's what HDR does for you. And it's up to you how much of the full dynamic range you need to use in whatever production you're doing.
We can kind of unleash the beast that is modern digital cinema cameras. I mean, these things have 15 stops of range, and HDR is actually a way better representation of what those cameras are seeing.
I've never had HDR monitoring on set. I've always been shooting with these new modern cameras, but monitoring in SDR. And so when you're monitoring an SDR, you're kind of keeping it, because the SDR monitor will clip and go drop into shadow a bit earlier than you would have otherwise if you had a proper HDR monitor, you actually keep things in a little bit safer. And then when you get to post with your colorist, you can then push it out and extend it, and you've got this huge amount of color space and dynamic range to push it into when you're grading in HDR. You're a little bit more conservative when you're shooting in that respect. Not always a bad thing, and then you can stretch it out and play with it later.
Once you're able to view the HDR image on set, you'll probably light in a slightly different manner because, depending on what you want to resolve, foreground, background, and your contrast-wise, you'll light in a different way. If you look in a log, image on your SDR monitor, and you might think you're capturing, full bright to full dark image, but once that is processed to Rec 2020 HDR, what you thought was good in the foreground is too dark, and we're resolving way too much in the background. So that difference between foreground, background becomes much, much bigger than what you would have had in SDR.
It's actually, for me personally, more about the shadows. We can do and see and use so much more information in the shadows. So if we're typically lighting a dark scene in maybe it's a cellar, it's a horror film, we'll still tend to put maybe a single bright source. And that was always kind of work visually to pin the shadows down. But now that source can be so much more brighter. Where we put the shadows can actually maybe be a little higher and still maintaining that sense of contrast. We can put so much more information in the shadows without compromising, still having that sense of contrast.
I think if I had that full HDR monitoring system set up and everyone had it, and I didn't have to satisfy a different range of expectations for directors or producers, but they all we're all seeing the same thing, it would give you a little bit more leeway to push things a bit further. It would help you more in some of those difficult situations where you've got actors in shade against a bright, hot background that you can't control, and you're really on the edge of dynamic range. And if you could monitor it properly in HDR, you could feel comfortable that, no, this is going to be fine. We've got this. We're in this stage now where we're straddling the SDR and HDR worlds, and we've got to try and make sure both look good. That's pretty tricky. But it's, like anything, it's always possible. In this transitional period, eventually everything will be HDR, and all the dailies will be HDR. People will be looking at them on HDR laptops, but we're not there yet.
With thanks to both the Post-Op Group and Cutting Edge, with colorists Marcus Friedlander and Dwayne Hyde, we loaded the footage from both the test shoot and the short film for analysis and discussion. We graded the footage in both SDR and HDR and looked at how the same images responded to the different image standards. We also took the HDR pass and, using Dolby Vision, created trims so that the HDR footage would play on multiple devices with varying capabilities with the same look created here in the suite.
So for our little daytime scene, we did it where we did a SDR grade first, which is the traditional grade, and then we extrapolated the HDR version from that. There was a conversion. And then for the second little part that we shot, which is the night scene, we did the opposite. So we started off with a full HDR grade as though we're finishing in HDR, and then used the Dolby Vision algorithm for conversion, which remaps it back to SDR where necessary. In fact, it's a variable sort of mapping, but what you could then do is trims within the Dolby Vision to try and get it creatively back to what you want. And what I learnt from this process just today was how important that trim pass is.
What Toby was after was to actually push the bright windows in the back up and really get it to that 1000 nits in HDR while keeping the rest of the signal about where we had it in the SDR.
Because you can always take that SDR sort of range of values, which may be muted even down from the full values, they'll just sort of go across. And then when you get into HDR, you then choose, okay, which levels are we going to sort of stretch out and fill up a bit of the HDR signal?
We really felt the intensity and the vibrance and the luminance of those strongly coloured LED lights in the background. And that's something that we weren't able to recreate in SDR. One of the dangers if we had just started SDR is we wouldn't have been able to know what information are in those lights, and then hadn't gone to HDR, that might have then changed the way that we graded the scene as a whole or the shot as a whole.
In certain levels of luminance, we're going to get more representation of colour in HDR because of the colour space and the brightness. So skin tones especially, you'll find there's a much more natural roll-off to highlight and natural roll-off between mid to highlight to black parts of skin tone. So generally you find, in my experience, that it's a much more natural, clean looking highlight, natural, clean looking skin tone than you're used to in SDR.
So one of the great things about HDR and Dolby HDR is that we have a bit more control about the way that that TV is going to interpret the images. I think we're always looking for ways to ensure as much as possible the images that we look at and sign off in the grade are replicated faithfully in people's homes.
So if it was an HDR Dolby Vision project for Netflix, I would feel safer taking something more to the limit of the edge of what we can see, because I'm more trusting that will be represented in broadcast.
As a DP, where you're trying to maintain an artistic integrity from the beginning of the show right through to the end, you don't want to, whatever point of that process where you get to, you don't want something completely different. So the beauty of Dolby Vision is that it contains metadata with the image that figures out what kind of display it's actually going to be displayed on, and then tailors the HDR signal to give you the best possible or most accurate result on that particular TV. What that means creatively, though, it's kind of another pass, because that metadata that tries to replicate most accurately the intent of the HDR grade into a SDR or semi-SDR or halfway in between world, let's put in some trims in there to try and make it look artistically, even though it's a completely different format than the HDR, which is our beautiful hero master, we can trim it a bit to try and make that SDR version look as pleasing as possible, rather than just letting the machine do it.
So once we finished the HDR grade for Handled, we did another pass in Resolve, and we put the trims in for the SDR version. And we put it to a Dolby analysis initially. And I was genuinely surprised. What Dolby Vision spat out for the SDR version was very, very good. We ended up only adding one trim.
To recreate what Dolby analysis will do to get me into SDR from HDR, the algorithm, the gamma change, whatever they're doing in the back end of that system is almost impossible to replicate.
Metadata can give me confidence that where I put shadows and highlights, especially at the extreme ends, which in the past is likely to be clipped off or crushed out on different sets. But with the metadata system, you can work deeper into the shadows and deeper into the highlights with the confidence that the viewers will still be able to see it. It's the first time that the consumer or the presentation display device, the TV, the iPhone, the iPad, whatever it is, can now be brought under control. So in some ways, the image pipeline that we're used to is now extending out and including the consumer's device. Dolby Vision itself as a standard is still moving forward. There's Dolby IQ, and Dolby IQ is already available in sets that you can buy now. And what it can do is sense how much light is in the room and then change the tone mapping of its Dolby Vision. And probably most importantly, in certain modes, in certain positions, the Dolby IQ can turn off things like motion smoothing, sharpening, noise reduction, all those things that are terribly bad for the image.
You would always want to test lighting and the effects of lighting within a set, initially before using it. High bright lights. Again, it's clipping, colours. To test that to make sure things are going to represent as you would want them to in HDR.
Knowing that I'm about to embark on a Netflix movie in New Zealand very shortly, and I've been thinking about this exact issue. It's not likely it hasn't got a budget to allow for HDR monitoring on set, but what I will do is probably do a HDR session in testing where I will have a HDR monitor for a day, maybe test some of the kind of things, or maybe some of the rough kind of environments that we're likely to work with. Now, I know in this movie there's going to be a lot of neon signs behind actors' heads because it all takes place in a bar or whatever. So you might actually do a test specifically for that with your HDR monitor, put it through the HDR workflow, talk to your colorist, and this is where it's really important to get your colorist involved with your show from day one.
So I guess the argument to be made for starting with HDR is you increase your ability to be creative in the grade. Starting with SDR first, you can absolutely do that same grade in HDR. Working in HDR first enables you to push further in those grades. Let's say you're doing a nature documentary and you have a sky that you're sitting at 100 nits. Now, traditionally in SDR, that sky would be white. If you wanted to put any blue into that sky, that would require bringing down the luminance of the sky in order to have some color information. One of the great things about HDR now is that you can keep that sky at 100 nits or even brighter if you want to, and still have it be blue, and quite a saturated blue as well. HDR can sometimes mean darker. Sometimes if you have a TV that's really bright and you're watching an SDR image, it might stretch that SDR image to 500 nits, 600 nits, depending on how bright that TV is. Whereas that same image in HDR with the right flagging, you're now going to see an image that might be actually quite darker, something that the director and the cinematographer and colorist have set in the room. There's a couple of reasons why in HDR you do have more detail in the shadows. The first is that it's a 10-bit signal. That compared to broadcast SDR, which is 8-bit. In HDR, if you want, you're able to move the entire signal of the image up in terms of luminance. And as long as the highlights come up a little bit more, you'll still have that same feeling of contrast and therefore the same feeling of shadows without needing to sit your shadows as far down. What this means is that you've actually created space in the bottom end of the signal, and you can play with that space to really see all the detail in it and shape exactly how those shadows feel with the detail.
There was a shot of one of our actresses, and in the background of that shot there were some practicals, I think some lights for a painting. Now, when I was monitoring that in SDR, those practicals were fine. There were absolutely no issue. They were not competing. But when we looked at the same image in the HDR format, suddenly those pracs had, the brightness level had raised so much that, and they were so close to her face that they were drawing your eye away from the actress, and that's not a good thing. If I'd been monitoring in HDR on location, I would have spotted that.
So in HDR, the whole highlight clipping scenario becomes a slightly bigger issue than in SDR. Because SDR, the difference between full clip sensor and bright part of the image is minimal. So 100 nits to 80 nit face is not far, but 80 nit lit face to 1,000 nit clip sensor and HDR is a big difference, and it becomes very distracting.
We work in HDR in a P3 color space, normally a D65 white point, and then we put that grade into a Rec 2020 container. And in doing that, what we're actually doing is we're future-proofing our grades. It means that in however many years, when we eventually do have Rec 2020 screens, all of our grades that are P3 but live in that Rec 2020 container will maintain and will be future-proofed.
For the people who are doing natural history programs, documentaries, HDR offers a lot. The ability to build the contrast to a level that, in a sense, creates a much stronger sense of reality, creates an immersion for the viewers, a sense that you're looking through a window and seeing a real world. I think HDR is a really powerful tool for them.
HDR doesn't imply any certain specific look. Rather, it's a set of technologies that allow us to create even more looks and all of the looks we could always do.
If you're lighting for a look, you don't really need to change too much at all. Just be aware that highlights are going to be much brighter, that there is going to be a slightly different colour representation than you're used to in SDR, but lighting's lighting, and if you get it right, that's the main thing.
One of the interesting aspects of HDR is that it isn't necessarily expensive. Hopefully in this year, in 2022, we'll see from Small HD and others some reasonably cost-effective HDR Onset monitors. And once we've got that, I think we'll be able to see people begin to be able to take advantage of HDR, to really leverage what it can do when you can see it. Even lower budget productions can embrace HDR. And in terms of grading, what we found was we just did a HDR grade and our trim pass added very little extra time. I will qualify this statement. If you want a very large production with multiple departments and with rushes going to studios and, it's a more complex system that would need to change. HDR, SDR, it's not chalk and cheese. It's not a completely fundamental change in the way cinematographers that we will need to work. But is it better? Hell yeah. We've got more contrast, more colour. I mean, all these things are absolutely positives.
HDR is no longer a discussion for the future. It's here now, and it's the framework for image creation in the 21st century. Artistically, the window of exposure and colour is greatly expanded, and it creates opportunities for new artistry. The American Society of Cinematographers, through their Standard Evaluation Material 2, or STEM 2 project, have created benchmark quality HDR footage as part of a short film, The Mission. The footage is free to download if you're interested in seeing how it would travel through your post-production pipeline and how HDR footage can and should look on an HDR display.